Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Wine, Women, and Words. Joining us, as always, is Michelle.
Hello.
You got to be quick on the uptake for when
I
we
know.
get late.
I almost missed it, but I got it.
You got to get used to that. You're gonna have to get used to the sidekick status in the intro.
I'll get there. I'll get there. I promise.
Yes, well, we'll give you some practice. And our guest this evening is Paulette Kennedy, and we are going to discuss The Devil and Mrs. Davenport with her. So thank you, Paulette, so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I have been so excited to discuss this book with you. Michelle, I think from the very beginning when I started reading it, I was sending her messages going, I can't wait to discuss this book. I love this book so much.
Many text messages were received.
Well, I'm
So yes, we're
flattered.
very
Thank you.
excited to have you on the show and be able to pick your brain about this book.
So
Well,
for
I'm
those who
excited to
are
be here.
not familiar with this book, could you give us a brief synopsis?
Sure. So, The Devil and Mrs. Davenport is a mid century Gothic about a 1950s housewife who receives psychic abilities after a short illness. And this is tied and closely related to the murder of a missing young woman in the community of Myrna Grove, Missouri, which is loosely based on my hometown of Springfield, Missouri. And the what happens with Loretta, my main character, is that after she develops these psychic abilities, it sets her at odds with her husband, who is very, very religious and feels like her newfound psychic abilities are not a gift from God as Loretta sees them, but perhaps a gift from the devil. And so there's a lot of conflict and a lot of trouble that ensues after this. And the scope of the book is really about like suburban middle America during the 1950s and women's roles in society during that time. And Loretta is kind of a very special character to me in many, many ways.
I really liked Loretta's character so much, and I was doing a talk earlier in the month, and I was discussing um, the subject of agency because the topic that I'll do classes on is building strong women in historical fiction. And with and for those of you who are listening, just to let you know, historical fiction still it goes up to the 1970s now, which pretty soon, within my lifetime, 1980s is going to be considered historical fiction, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that.
And it already is in mine. I'm a 1974 baby, so I'm historical.
That's kind of, is it a weird feeling for you?
It is a very weird feeling sometimes, especially like when even like sometimes they're calling 90s based fiction historical fiction now. And I'm like, the 90s were 10 years ago. What
They
are you
are not.
talking
Stop
about?
it. I refuse to accept that.
I, I was, man, the book that I'm working on is dual timeline, and I was thinking about making the present. I was going to make the present day in the 1990s because it just lines up with the stuff in the past so much better. And I'm like, oh man. Now you say that, I'm like, oh man, it's not going to be so much present day, but it's still considered. I still think of that contemporary.
I
Not,
think so too. And
yeah.
and women my
Well,
age love books set in the 90s. I can tell you that.
well, I had an interesting moment where my kids asked me if I was born in the 1900s, and I was very offended the way that they said, "You were born in the 1900s?" Like, excuse me, that was like 10 years ago in my mind. Okay. The
Yeah.
1900s was not that far away.
Uh, anyway, back to the original point of the
We're
story.
we're supposed to be talking about books though, right?
Yes, yes, not completely, wallowing in the
It's
fact that we're
okay.
all old now. Um, on this episode of The Golden Girls,
We're gonna embrace the hag, ladies. Let's just
I
embrace
totally
the
am.
hag.
I'm embracing those
Yes.
gray
Yeah.
hairs. I am not going to get rid of them. I want to be going back to the conversation we had before the show started. I want to be the eccentric writer. I want to be that old woman where you look at her and you're like, she's some sort of artist or is she just a crazy lady? That's what that's my goal. That's
Yeah,
my
yeah.
goal when I hit my 70s.
It's a solid goal.
Hmm.
It is.
So when I was teaching my class on building strong women in historical fiction, I actually compared this book, The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, to the agency of Anita Garibaldi would have in The Woman in Red, because different age groups or decades have different agency that of things that women can do during the time period. And the 50s for Loretta, while we think of it still as the start of a modern age in the United States, it really wasn't for a lot of women.
No, it really wasn't. And I think perhaps we might have that impression because of the golden age of Hollywood and whatnot, what we see on screen. There were a lot of very feisty heroines in movies and things like that. You think of Joan Crawford and Betty Davis, who played very, very progressive type characters. But for the majority of women, especially in middle America and in the South, very traditional ways of living, what we would call tradwife kind of lifestyle was the norm, more or less, in the 50s. And the amount of agency a woman had was kind of correlated to what her husband allowed her to do, unfortunately. And staying at home with the children and raising the children, keeping a home, those were expectations that a lot of women had in the Midwest and the South, especially. And a lot of women never worked outside of the home. And if they did, it was during World War II, whenever their husbands were overseas. And I think that you start seeing a little bit of a shift in what women considered agency in the 50s, because especially if they had worked outside of the home in the 1940s during the war, they got a little bit of a taste of what a man's world was, where you get up and you go to work and you come home and you earn a living and you're able to care for your home and all the things that are coming into your home. Um, and I think that that was where you saw the tide beginning to shift to where women's liberation and women's rights started coming to the fore a bit more after World War II. And like I go over this in the book, but until 1974, most states would not allow a woman to have a checking account or open a line of credit without having a male co-signer, preferably their husband. I mean, if they weren't married, they could have their father or brother or someone else in the family co-sign on an account, but that alone limited a lot of a woman's agency. And so the woman had to be very clever. And so in The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, I show Loretta doing some of the same things that I saw my grandmother and my mom do. Um, like especially when it came to money, like having money of their own, like what we would call in historical fiction pin money, money
Mhm.
to just like spend on whatever they wanted. So Loretta writes her checks for slightly over when she goes to the grocery store and saves up cash that way. And that's one of the ways that she maintains her agency. And a lot of it too is like having the radio that she hides because her husband doesn't allow her to listen to popular music or rock and roll. She can only listen to like Christian or like affirmative, like family oriented programs on the radio. So she has her own radio that she pulls out whenever he's not home. So even though it might not seem like women had a lot of agency at different periods in history, they found ways to exert their agency. And I think that's really important with historical fiction to show that women weren't completely helpless creatures.
Exactly. And yeah, that religious aspect of the book, I think I found that scarier than the ghosts themselves, which we will discuss in a moment. But
Yes.
I think that was the true terror. And I don't say this to offend anybody who is a Christian. It's just a matter of that fundamentalism. I know I've talked about this briefly in the podcast before. I've come from a fundamentalist religion growing up, and Paulette, you the same. if it's okay for you for me to say, also, you also came from that kind of same kind of background as well. We've
Sure.
discussed this over
Yes.
lunch, and there is this oppressive attitude, just not just for how women act, but like for how anybody acts in general.
hmm Yeah, so I feel like a lot, and again, like you said, I don't want to cast a wide net and say that all Christianity is this way, but in my late teens and early 20s, when I was very active with fundamentalism, it was very much a shame and fear-based type of religion, and everyone kind of came under that same kind of fear-based teaching. And so a lot of things weren't allowed. Like I remember one of my friends, like, just going to a restaurant that served alcohol was frowned upon because someone might see you even if you weren't drinking in a restaurant that served alcohol and feel like maybe you were partaking in alcohol when you shouldn't be. So there was a lot of that kind of belief, even in the 90s, whenever I was really active in the Assemblies of God, about that sort of thing. And especially for women, you weren't to date uh, someone who wasn't a fundamentalist Christian. Even, you know, it, I don't want to get too deep into it, but like there was this kind of belief that Catholics weren't Christians. Like even
Mhm.
if dating a Catholic, if you were Assemblies of God and dating a Catholic, oh well, you have to be equally yoked. There was like that whole like be equally yoked, and then you have to have like counseling before you can start
And if
like
you
getting serious
weren't,
with someone.
yes, and if
Yes.
you weren't, you were missionary dating. That was the thing. You were missionary dating.
Yes. You're
And that
trying to
was like this
convert.
whole thing as well. Like if I didn't
Yeah.
if I liked a boy and the the boy didn't go, it was just starting to come to our church, or if he didn't come to the church, our church. It wasn't just the fact that we were Assemblies of God, it had to be our church.
hmm
That was the
Yes.
thing. And it was, my mother was like always like, That's missionary dating." And my mother was like, somebody else would be like, "Oh, that's missionary dating." Even if the boy was like showing like interest in you, they're like, "Oh, be careful, they might be that don't fall into missionary dating."
Yeah. And he might cause you to backslide. There was always stuff here. The backsliding was like, ooh, you don't want to backslide. And I just remember like being at funerals, and this has even happened somewhat recently, being at funerals and overhearing people say things like, well, I think he was still right with Jesus whenever he passed away. And this is somebody that had been baptized as a Christian. I was like, so you can lose your salvation that easily? Like, if you like, I don't like the whole mechanics of how being that kind of Christian worked. It seemed like they were so mutable and so subject to your actions. And for a type of Christianity that claimed not to be works based, it felt like it was very much works based type religion, and grace didn't really have a lot to do with it.
Mhm.
And so that was something that, like, there's just a lot of controlling aspects about fundamentalism and evangelical Christianity where I felt like eventually, once I started to kind of wake up and move away from it a little bit, it's like, well, where was the love? Where was the grace? Where was the compassion? And I just started kind of seeing a little bit of too much hypocrisy. And that's what made me kind of move away from it. And once I kind of moved away from it, I started seeing it a lot more clearly. And, a little bit of that is where this book came from. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
you could definitely see the working out of the fundamentalists, like how that can like really hold on to somebody, and then working your way through the feelings of it. And then as somebody who was also raised in the fundamentalist world, and I didn't really have the option of being able to like step aside, because I don't know if I've shared this before with others with the podcast or with listeners. I was 17 and labeled as a witch.
Yeah.
And just because I wanted to do normal 17-year-old things. Was not
Yeah.
casting spells, was not doing anything witchcrafty at all. I just wanted to be with my friends as a 17-year-old girl.
Yeah.
And so that was just like that rude awakening of, well, this is not a faith for me kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And it's hard because you do build a community and you build a sense of belonging whenever you're really super involved with church. And that's where your friends are and everything. So it is hard once you decide to kind of break away from that. And I wasn't raised really deeply. I was kind of like Loretta, like church was something that we went to every now and then, but I didn't really start getting super involved in religion and fundamentalism until I was like 19, 20 years old. And I had a friend who was super involved in church, and she's kind of the one that brought me in and kind of mentored me, I guess. And that was kind of where it all started. But that kind of extremist thinking, and also like we were kind of in that whole satanic panic era in the 80s and 90s too with fundamentalism. And I remember my friend told me, she's like, you need to get rid of all of your heavy metal music because it's satanic. And, I remember like breaking my CDs and like throwing them in the trash. And now that to me just seems so wild and so like crazy that I did all of that. But like at the time, I felt like it was, well, I don't want anything to ruin my witness, and so yeah, and that's kind of how it's couched. And like you were talking about the witchcraft, like just being interested in normal pop culture things, or like wearing makeup, or being interested in fashion, of course clothing and modesty and all of that has a lot to do with fundamentalist culture as well. And the whole thing of like legislating how a woman dresses and how her body appears like around men, and don't lead a man astray, by your beauty. That whole like putting it all on women, like we're responsible for men's choices when it comes to us and all of that. So yeah. it can get really heavy really fast when you start talking about this
and
stuff.
that's where
Yeah.
I was just like, when I said the book would, I think I was halfway through the book where I was just like, I was terrified. It was, and it was a different point. I was like, it was early in the morning, I couldn't sleep, so I was reading this book, which I recommend reading the book. I don't recommend doing it at like 5 o'clock in the morning before the sun's up. And there's certain scenes in the book where I'm just like, the scene, I'm looking at the end of the foot of my bed, like, um, yeah, Paulette, you know the scene exactly where I'm just like, okay, I need to have the light on. It's time for me to actually get up and get out of bed. And I think that's when I texted you about it. I was like, I get done and I go downstairs with my husband. I'm like, I hope I didn't offend her.
No, no, not at all. To be honest, Diana, that book, like, because I write at that time of morning, like before everybody gets up. So I get up at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to do my writing. And there were times when I was writing that book where I got freaked out. It felt like somebody was watching me and stuff. So yeah, I totally get it. So I guess it was a good sign that it was scaring me, because then I knew it would scare everybody else. So
Well, and the tension, and I think this kind of leads into the tension question that we have, in that you have the combination of the religion and then you have the ghosts and the buildup of it. How did you work in the tension into it? Because a lot of times I felt like this slow moving freight train that's coming, and then all of a sudden it's like there and boom at the end. And at the end,
yeah.
you know what I'm talking about, because I don't want to give away any spoilers. But let's talk for a moment about how you built up the tension within the story.
Well, my pacing, like I think I kind of have a style of pacing where I tend to like set the story up, and then like past the midpoint things go really really fast, and that tends to be the case with all three of my books so far. But whenever I was writing this book, I was really influenced and inspired by Shirley Jackson and how she wrote her mid-century Gothics, and that low simmering like feeling of dread is something that is in all of her work. I reread her entire catalog whenever I was writing this book and pulled a lot of inspiration from it. And especially like some of her lesser known works like The Road Through the Wall and Hangs a Man, where that sense of slow building dread is something that you can feel and the outright horror doesn't really start to happen until toward the end, and things get really, really dark really fast. And so I probably was pulling a little bit of that, whether consciously or subconsciously, into how I chose to do my pacing with this book. But the tension, a lot of the tension comes from the claustrophobic feeling that Loretta has of being trapped in her own home because of the controlling tendencies of her husband. And, not to give away too many spoilers and such, but as her internal journey and arc, as she starts striving a little bit more toward knowing herself and her independence, the external factors in her life become more and more constraining. And so they're kind of, there's a parallel there that's going on. It's kind of a mirroring situation. And one of my friends, Agatha Andrews from She Wore Black, she said, this book is like Carrie. It reminds me a lot of Carrie by Stephen King, because you have this ultra religious character who is dominating this character that has psychic abilities and feels very othered throughout the novel. And there are definitely influences there too, because I read a lot of Stephen King growing up as well. But I think that the dread and the sense of something terrible is getting ready to happen. A lot of people have told me, especially recently while they've been reading it, that it made them very angry. That certain parts of the book made them very, very angry and created like a really strong emotional response in them. And I won't give away which parts, but I kind of wanted people to feel, especially women and people with uteruses, to feel angry reading this book, because I kind of feel like what happens to Loretta is kind of what's happening to all of us collectively right now with politics and everything that's happening with laws being overturned and the regression that we're starting to see. And so it's a little bit like I wasn't maybe necessarily consciously doing that the entire time that I was writing this story, but it's there. It's definitely a concern of mine, and it's something that I think about all the time. So
I love that you brought up Carrie, because I read Carrie fairly recently and I hated it. And it was the religious aspect of it. And because my dad was like, "Oh, you're gonna love it because of the religious aspect." And I was like, I hated it because of that. But yet this, even though this has that Carrie feel, I feel like there's more of, maybe it's more of the feminist spin to it.
mm-hmm.
I feel that more than what Carrie had. That I
Yeah.
think that's what separates it the most from it for me.
Yeah. And I think with Carrie too, like it's written by a man, of course, but also it's the mother, it's
Mhm.
the mother against the daughter. And that's really hard for me. And not, I mean, there are definitely bad mothers in my work, but I'm kind of to this point, like, and I love a female villain, and I think female villains have a role in fiction, but I didn't want to do that with this book. If I wanted to kind of do the opposite, where like the women are helping one another and they're bonding, and especially with one character in particular that I don't want to talk about because spoilers. I wanted to kind of show something that might surprise some people, like her response to this character, Loretta's response to this character might not have been what a lot of readers would have expected, given the circumstances. But I wanted to kind of show that, like, we know who the real enemy is here, and we're going to bond and work together to defeat this common enemy that we have. And I don't think that really happened in Carrie as much. And Carrie was such a sad story, I felt
Mhm.
like, in so many ways. It was very sad. And, as someone who was really bullied a lot growing up, I identified with Carrie, and I do with Loretta as well, because I always kind of felt like I was on the outside looking in too. But Carrie definitely, I feel like, does a different thing than what my book is doing. So, yeah, there are parallels for sure, but yeah, they're different.
So, as the resident fantasy author of this duo, I have to talk about the ghosts in your novel and
Yes.
how you created their world, their rules. Did you kind of approach it from as a fantasy author would when creating the rules of magic, or how did you work on building that aspect of the novel?
For the ghosts in this one, especially, and I have like pulled from fantasy with some of my other work, especially with The Witch of Ten Mountain. I feel like that one is almost more of a dark fantasy than Southern Gothic. But with this book, I used the ghost as a little bit of a catalyst. And I really honestly studied a lot of mediums and listened to a lot of interviews with mediums and what they experienced or experience whenever someone who has passed comes to them. Um, and some of their experiences, especially a lot of them had their first encounter with a ghost or spirit whenever they were young, and how that manifested and how that looked. And so I did a lot of research on that kind of thing whenever I brought my ghosts in. So it wasn't necessarily like a magic system set of rules. It was more or less just what I encountered whenever I was doing my research on paranormal investigation, on paranormal, like with the Duke Parapsychology Lab and the interviews that J.B. Ryan and the other scientists did with mediums and what they experienced whenever they were communicating with people that had departed this life. So, like Loretta, whenever her abilities manifest and she learns how to control them, first the spirits are kind of desperate because she doesn't really know how to communicate with them or control it. But as she gets more adept, she learns how to gain a little bit more agency and control over her abilities with the help of Dr. Hansen, and like the opening and shutting the door in her mind and whatnot. Those are all things that I pulled from my research on mediumship and psychic ability. And the whole clairvoyance and clairaudience and all of that comes out in the book.
Well, since you brought up Dr. Hansen, I feel like we need to have just a moment of Dr. Hansen love. And Paulette, I want you to share with our listeners who your inspiration was for Dr. Hansen.
Oh, there are several inspirations for Dr. Hansen. He's probably my favorite male character that I've written thus far. But J.B. Ryan with Duke Parapsychology is definitely the inspiration for his scientific side and like his studies of interest. But as far as who he looks like, he looks like Jude Law in The Holiday. That's who I was seeing, like whenever I was writing him, with the glasses and like the endearing like sense of humor, and that's who I pictured. But there's also a little bit of Mulder, in him too, and he wants to believe. They have a little bit of a Mulder and Scully dynamic, he and Loretta, although Loretta's not necessarily a skeptic. She's just like, why in the hell is this happening to me? Like, can you help me? Like, it's not necessarily, and Dr. Hansen is like, well, this is what I've discovered and found out. So he's like pragmatic, and he's an educator, and he's an intellectual. And so he really helps ground her abilities in what he has discovered through his research. So he was a fun character to write, and I wanted to make him interesting and dynamic. And even though, and I also wanted to maybe surprise people a little bit about the Midwest and Missouri and whatnot, because we do have like really intellectual people that live in the Midwest and in the South. And he is not an outlier. I mean, certainly, yes, there are a lot of people that are just salt of the earth type people, but we do have, like, I'm from a college town. Like we have Bible colleges, but we have like two major universities in my town too. So there are very like highly intelligent people that live in the town that I'm from. And he's one of them, and in my mind. And so I really had a lot of fun writing him. And the response I'm getting from readers that they're like the dreamy doctor or the hot doctor, and he is. I mean, I love him, and I love an intellectual man. I love nerdy, like smart guys are kind of my catnip. So he was fun to write for that reason.
Yeah, nerdy smart guys. I love the phrase catnip because yeah, the catnip as well. And then there's also a gentleness about him that
Mhm.
I juxtaposed with the chaos that is going on in Loretta's world and the sternness with her husband, who he like when people like were physically pissed off, there were so many times where he was the one who just pissed me off so many
Mhm.
times. And that calmness, having a guy that's just calm when you're a chaos gremlin like myself, having the calmness that's there is always a benefit. I see you laughing at me, Michelle.
Yes.
I think anytime we successfully use the word juxtaposed in a sentence about books, I feel very like high literature. So I
Yes.
I appreciated that comment.
It's a fancy word. It's a good
It,
word,
it is. You
juxtaposed.
don't often
Yes.
get to use it in normal everyday conversation.
I feel like one of those, intellectuals, those college level intellectuals from like the Midwest that you were talking about,
Before you
Paulette.
know it, we're going to talk about
Yes,
symbolism
yes.
and allegory and
Well, I mean,
Like we did in literary criticism. Yes, it's
yes.
fun.
Well, your symbolism with the house was just chef's kiss. See, I was just going
Oh,
along there,
thank you.
Michelle. Thank you. Yes.
I set that up just beautifully. Like, look at that
Yes.
segue.
I just slid right in
Yeah.
there. Just slid in Paulette's DMs like that.
Yeah, the house at one point I remember asking my editor, I was like, is this whole situation with the house just completely off base and like too much of a heavy-handed metaphor? And she was like, no, it's great. Just keep doing it. Keep doing what you're doing. And so yeah, that was kind of fun. And there's, again, not to give too much away, but there's a lot of basis and fact and um like what happens geologically in the area that I'm from a lot, with the house and what happens with the house. So again, not to give too much away, but all of that was very well researched, and I have had people that I know that sort of thing has happened to. So while it is something that can be explained by science, there's also like the whole psychic element. And I wanted people to wonder, okay, is this something that Loretta is doing or even something that Lucas is doing? That is a manifestation of the level of frustration and repressed anger that is going on within that household. And I think that is something that people pick up on a lot whenever they're reading too, is like just this low-lying simmer of like repressed anger that's going on. And definitely with Loretta's telekinetic manifestation of her abilities, that's where a lot of that comes into play, with the plates breaking and the mirror breaking. All of that was my way of kind of exhibiting that inside, even though she's trying to portray this really demure, like submissive type wife, like she has all of this anger that's like boiling up within her. And I think that is something that a lot of women have experienced in their lives, whether it's with an abusive partner or just with the way misogyny and the patriarchy works, like with our careers and a lot of other things. Like a lot of us are holding like some of that kind of anger and that like hypervigilance within us at all times. And I think that's why I chose to make her telekinetic.
Now, I do believe, Michelle, it's time for our super, super duper serious.
Very serious.
Yeah, and I
Yes.
think the fact
This
that I
is
did
when
super
you have to
duper
push your glasses all the way up
all
the
the way up
bridge of
there,
your
they're all the way
nose.
up to my.
You have to
Okay.
adjust and make sure they're centered.
All right, since I've been doing all the talking, Michelle, I'll let you take the role, the serious question.
The
I'll let you
serious
take
part,
Dr.
yes, I
Hanson's role.
appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I
You're welcome.
will make the bridge with my fingers or steeple my fingers as we like to say in the writing world. So our super serious survey. In our writing experiences, Diana, she writes historical fiction. And in her writing world, she is very precise. She plots, she outlines, she plans everything out. But in the existing world, the actual world, I think your phrase earlier was a goblin of chaos, if I heard that correctly.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And then for me, I write fantasy. And when I write, I am 100% a pantser. I don't even know what my characters are going to do. They surprise me, they let me know what's happening, and we're all surprised together, and it's amazing. But in my world, I am a lover of lists. I color code. I am very type A and organized. So we like to ask authors where they fall on that spectrum for their writing and where they fall on that spectrum for the actual world that we are forced to live in on a regular basis.
Well, my answer is a little bit of both. So internally, my mind is always going 90 miles an hour, and I am a complete chaos demon up here in my head. But I am a totally organized person for the most part when it comes to my writing and also with just tasks and things. I have a running list on my iPhone, like never ending to-do list in my notes app that I live and die by. And that really helps me a lot. But like, I am at my heart like an ADHD chaos queen. Like I the thoughts are always like just going 90 miles an hour in my mind, and everything always feels so much more urgent than it actually is because of my anxiety. So a little bit of both, but like when my writing, I used to be a pantser. I wasn't very good at it. I applaud you for being a good pantser, Michelle, and it being your superpower because
I
it is
think
not
good
my
is
superpower.
I think good is subjective, but I'll take the compliment.
Yeah. I tried it and I ended up having to rewrite Parting the Veil 3 times because I pantsed the hell out of that book. And so I learned that I needed, for me personally, I need a little bit of an outline, a little bit of structure, but I still do some discovery writing. Within the scope of my outlines, I leave room to play. But my major plot points are usually always down on paper before I start drafting. And now that like I have an agent and everything and I'm selling books on proposal, it is really beneficial and it really helps to have an outline or a synopsis before I start to where at least I know where I'm going. But if my character really wants to like come up with something new and point me in a different direction, I'm open to it.
And I love the fact that you brought up the ADHD thing because that I have that as well. And I feel like there's so much of our lives, especially being from our generation, where we're with they call us lost girls in our generation,
Mm.
because in our generation they didn't consider girls to have ADHD.
Mm-mm.
We
Mm-mm.
weren't. I mean, I think I've brought this up on the show before. I had the discussion with my mom, and my mom was just like, I brought up the fact that with my ADHD and something about sugars. And she was like, well, yeah, of course we couldn't give you any sugar because that just made you hyper. I'm like, yeah, that wasn't it's ADHD. No, no, it was the sugars.
Yeah.
Okay, mom.
You were
Okay.
just hyper. It's fine.
Yeah. But there's just this element within our writing where I feel like the having those rods, it's like the lightning rods is kind of how I
Mhm.
like to think of my plot, where I have this story that I can go along, and yes, you've got the room to play, but I have these points that I can come back to where I know where I'm going, because knowing myself with ADHD, I'm gonna wind up somewhere in the middle of Jamaica when I'm supposed to
Right.
be in Southern California.
Yeah. I put some people on a boat with Parting the Veil. They were on a boat and we had to cut 75% of that book. I had some wonderful help with great freelance editor, Maria Thoreau. And she's like, I love your writing. Your writing is absolutely beautiful, but this plot is not going anywhere. It's like 3 books packed into one novel. Like, and we've got to separate things out and restructure. So that really taught me that I need what I call a tent pole outline, which is where I have my inciting incident, my midpoint climax, and then my actual climax or my denouement. Like I know where things are going to end before I start. And that helps me so much with like staying focused and not getting burnout on what I'm writing, because that was a huge problem for me too, probably because of my ADHD, which was undiagnosed, is that I was starting projects with a lot of energy but never finishing anything because I would get so bogged down in being a perfectionist, and being completely overwhelmed with the thought of writing 100,000 words. And like I would get to about 20,000 words and I would just give up. And until I kind of broke through and really figured out that I could actually finish a novel length manuscript, that held me back a lot.
Yeah, for me, I think it was just not having that plot idea to be able to finish it, where it's just like, okay, I've got enough of a meat of a story, or I have enough of an outline of a story where I can plan, I can write a novel based on this. Because yeah, I get to that 25,000 words and I'd be like, okay, I'm done. I can't, I've got nothing more
Yeah,
in the
yeah. And then
story.
you just keep going back and revising what you've already written and not making any forward momentum. And then I would just get burnt out. And I feel like as a neurodivergent person, I think and I see that with my kid, and my kid was how I realized that I'm also neurodivergent. Just seeing some of the things that we coped with that. And, now that he is getting treatment for like some of these things, it's like it's completely different like situation. And that helped me realize that there's something else going on here besides my ability to stay organized or on task. Like there's something going on neurologically with my brain, that being wired differently, that I have to learn how to work with and manage. And there are days, there are good days and bad days. And I think that if I get enough sleep, and if my routine is steady and I keep my routine, like I am a very much a routine oriented writer. Like I get up every day at 4 a.m. and make my coffee and clean out the cat's litter boxes. Then I sit down and I write, because if I don't, they're screaming at me if they're not fed, and all their needs are not met. So I've learned ways to like manage my neurodivergent like quirks.
Mhm. And I feel like that's something that so many of our generation we've done, is that we've had to learn how to cope with it and how to manage it, and to the point where I know for me at this point where it's like I don't really want the medication because I already have my coping mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter of, do I really need the medication? And I think it's that juxtaposition. And I feel like the phrase plot bunnies was
Yes.
really designed for the authors such as us who have the
Yes.
ADHD. Plot bunnies are just going to go everywhere.
It's like, what if we did this? It's like you get this really good idea. Sometimes I'll email my agent or even my critique partner, like, well, what if we did this instead? And they're like, Paulette, stick to the plan. Stick to the plan. Like you're inventing more problems for yourself in the long run. And I have like gotten to that point, where I've written myself into a corner before because of plot bunnies. So
Mhm. Well, on that note, on the plot bunny note, we have definitely been here for our full hour and then some, or actually for a half hour and then some.
oh wow.
Yeah, you we went out when we went out to lunch. We were like, next thing we know, it was like 2 hours later. We're like,
I
oh goodness,
know.
we gotta go.
I guess we should go home now. That was a great,
I
great
am
lunch.
highly jealous of the fact that so many of our authors, and this is not intentional, it just works out this way, but so many of our authors are based in California within driving distance of Diana. And I get to hear, oh, I've had lunch with this person, or I went on a research outing with this person. And I'm just like, cool, tell me all about it. I'm living vicariously through all these author outings that you get to go on. But
I know.
yeah, it's fine. I'm just, simmering in my
I'm
jealousy. It's
sorry.
fine.
Michelle, dinner party of one.
It's fine. I'm fine. I'm just cuddling with my cat. But The Devil and Mrs. Davenport is out in the world now. So if you would like to order your own copy, please be sure to check out the link in our show notes. You can order your own copy from our bookshop on bookshop.org. As always, bookshop.org supports our incredible writers. It supports the podcast, but most importantly, it supports all of the wonderful indie bookstores out there. And Paulette, you're just going to have to get together with Diana again and have a cup of coffee for me.
Yes.
And you're going to have to come back on the podcast for the next book so we can chat more with you.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to come back.
Great. Well, have a good night, everybody.
Thank
Good
you so much.
night.
Enjoy the rest
Thank
of your
you.
evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.